Hello and welcome back to another episode of Blurble Reasoning. Today we are talking about Brandon Sanderson's standalone Cosmere novel, Warbreaker. Quick recap of my reading journey so far. I kind of decided I want to read all of the Cosmere, and I read Elantris, and then I reread the first Mistborn trilogy not so long ago, culminating in my first time reading through Mistborn Secret History, which was a blast, and then I decided to kind of put a buffer between Era 1 and Era 2 by reading Warbreaker, because it just kind of felt like a natural place to do that. This does mean that Secret History notwithstanding, I am kind of reading in publication order so far, but that's not going to hold up. I'm not sticking to that. But yeah, I've never really chosen to stick to an author and read everything they've ever done before, and it is interesting because you do end up reading books which you might not have picked otherwise, such as Warbreaker. There's nothing about the blurb of this book that necessarily puts me off. It just doesn't draw me in as much as blurbs of some other books might do. But yes, this is the tale of two sisters and one slightly petulant god. One of the sisters is shipped off to an arranged marriage with the God King, also known as the enemy kingdom's leader, and the other one runs off to try and save them, and things escalate from there. Now, I will say, I'm not super in love with the magic system in this book, at least not so much as Brandon Sanderson's other magic systems that we've seen in his other works. It's billed as being a magic system built around colour, and you kind of use your breath to give life to things which then enhance their colour, and then you can take your breath back from them and the colour dulls and all that stuff, and you've got different kinds of ways of utilising this power, such as awakening objects or creating lifeless soldiers and that kind of thing. But I feel like it was more soul magic than it was colour magic. So much of the narrative was about the colours and stuff, and I get that it's a heavy theme because of how the magic is visualised, but honestly, I think I would have been a little bit more sold on the magic system up front if it was more described as the manipulation of souls, I guess. It's not necromancy, but it's kind of necromancy, just kind of painted differently. It doesn't have any of the dark themes of necromancy or anything like that. But yeah, it's an interesting one for sure. I think I would have preferred it if it was just necromancy. But I think the strongest part of this novel for me was the characters and the progression of their journeys. I won't get too into it because we're kind of doing this spoiler-free at the minute, but who the characters are at the start of a novel versus who they are at the end of a novel is two very different points in the story, and it's really interesting to track their journeys. Unlike with Elantris, I don't think there was any viewpoint character in this book that I found particularly tiresome. I did have a favourite though, Lightsong the Bold. I loved Lightsong the Bold. Our god perspective character, or our returned perspective character, and how he doesn't believe in his own faith, and how he's constantly witty, but he has this undercurrent of being incredibly troubled. I loved every word from his perspective. He was so great. I would also argue that Light Song is where we got a lot of the biggest lore drops, at least through the early to mid sections of the book. Maybe we learned some more stuff through Vivenna later towards the end, but his chapters were just always a joy. Brandon does good things with revelations in this book, with things that you are able to put together ahead of time, and whether you did or not is another story. I did not. Maybe it's just because I wasn't as engaged with his text as I have been with some of his other works, but I did not put a lot of the revelations together ahead of time, which led to a lot of "oh, of course" moments. But that's fine, because if I'm going "oh, of course," then I'm also putting it together and it makes sense within the narrative. I'm not sure I can go too much further into this story without starting to talk about spoilers, so I think I'm going to put a spoiler-free gap here. If you have not read the book and you fancy just a fun, I would say 4 out of 5 reading experience of a standalone fantasy novel within Brandon Sanderson's Cosmere, I would recommend this book to you. Go and have a look at Warbreaker. It's a fun time. If you are currently subscribed to Audible, it is a part of their subscription service, as in you don't have to spend a credit to be able to listen to it. Just as long as you're subscribed, you can listen to it, which is what I did. And also, yes, I know Amazon sucks. If you know any good competitors which have the books I enjoy reading on them, please let me know, but so far I've yet to really find any. Okay, spoilers time. So, the whole theme about the inevitability of war I found really interesting, because I remember it bothering me throughout the book that everyone was talking about how inevitable this war is, but we had yet to really meet any of the characters who really were pushing for it or were going to enact it. War was going to occur because everyone was trying to kind of like act proactively and self-defensively. And of course, this ended up being part of the problem, right? It was actually the Punkal who were kind of like twisting things behind the scenes and trying to force this war between these two big countries so that they could actually get their kingdom back. And I think something Warbreaker does really well is this narrative of this, you know, inevitability of war, especially from Vivenna's point of view, because you see her get corrupted by Denf and by Tonkfa. And by the way, since we're talking full spoilers, I also really loved the revelation that Demph and Vasher had this like centuries old grudge, and like they were these really old beings and stuff, and they were important figures from history who were just still alive today. But yeah, it was really cool to see how the past weaved into the present in terms of what had happened before was still important and relevant today and shaping events in the background, because that is how real history works. That is how our world works. And as someone who has a vested interest in learning about history, it is inevitably frustrating when watching people ignore the lessons of history and just charge headforth into inevitable wars which aren't really inevitable. They aren't. But yeah, anyway, sorry, that's me editorializing, I guess. Although I will say the Punkal, we didn't get a lot of time with them. And it is interesting to consider the idea of, like, from their point of view, obviously their means were bad, and you shouldn't incite a war between two nations. And like we see through Bluefinger's actions towards the end of the novel that he's very much an amoral man. But we never really take any time to stop and realize that the Punkal are, you know, treated as servants, and that this society is unjust in that way. They were conquered and made into a servant race. We don't spend a lot of time with that, and I feel like we could have spent a little more time with that. I feel like there's definitely room for sequels within this world. I don't know if Brandon Sanderson has ever expressed a desire to go back and write a book 2 and 3 and make this a trilogy like he plans to do with Elantris. But you get the impression that there is more that could be explored, more story which could be told and stuff like that. The subversion of expectations with the God King was definitely interesting, with Ciri ending up falling in love with him despite, you know, being forced into marriage with him. I think there was so much opportunity for that to come off wrong, and in my opinion, I don't think it did. We see that the God King is basically a puppet used by the priests who hasn't had the opportunity to really learn much of how the world works. He's very sheltered, and as he grows to understand things a little bit more, he very much gives Ciri the respect and the space that she needs, which actually allows love to flower quite naturally, I feel like. And I thought it was actually pretty wholesome how things turned out. I also mentioned Vivenna's journey earlier. I think her journey is really interesting, how she comes to Hallandren with this grand notion of saving her sister. Then she ends up admitting to herself that that's not the real reason why she's here. She ends up being corrupted into perpetuating the inevitability of war and trying to like put her people's interests first. And then when she falls and is broken down and ends up a beggar on the streets, and then how she kind of rebuilds herself up from there again is really interesting to see. We see her become less naive and more pragmatic. She understands that she should, you know, try and trust people based on their actions instead of their words, instead of the outward facade that they portray. It's about what they actually do. It's about how they actually respond to things. And I thought it was really interesting to see almost the kind of reversal of positions between the two sisters by the end of a novel. Maybe not entirely reversal, but in terms of, oh, the wrong sister was sent to marry the king and it actually turned out to be the right decision. It's not really the right decision, but you know what I mean? Like, it turned out better than it would have done if Vivenna had been sent to marry the God King. And Ciri actually came into her own as a person for the trials that she was thrown into. You know, she still shouldn't have been sent outright, but, you know. One thing I did take issue with was that Ciri still expressed fondness for her father throughout the duration of the novel, and I'm like, shouldn't you hate him? Shouldn't you hate him for sending you to marry the God King, the enemy of this other country who are on the brink of war with yours? This place of immense danger where you are expected to probably die, all because your father just preferred your older sister and couldn't face sending her away. Like, I get the whole he's still my dad thing, but it really just didn't seem like she held any malice towards her father for that decision. I think that was probably the most unrealistic part of this entire book. I also really enjoyed the conflict within Lightsong's heart, because he is also, like the God King, leading quite a sheltered existence as a god. And we see how Blushweaver tries to manipulate him and stuff. And we see him be like, but the queen couldn't surely be evil, could she? Like, but hang on a minute, Idris couldn't really be all that bad. Do we really need to go to war? And all the time Blushweaver's like, we have to protect our interests, Lifesong. Blushweaver very much came across as the villain of the piece until I understood that it was really the Punkal behind everything. And ultimately, I'm still kind of trying to work out in my head what was going on there. I think she was also being manipulated, because the Punkal did send her to the dungeons and cage her and then end up killing her. And by the way, that scene drew a fucking gasp from me. That was sufficiently shocking and horrible and sad. And I'm also really sad that Lightsong, I knew from the minute that we had this whole thing near the beginning of his perspective, where we learn about how he's expected to give his life up to save someone, and he finds that horrible, and it builds a lot of conflict within his own heart, because he's clearly a very good and a very giving person, but you can't just ask someone to end their own life to save someone else all the time. That's a hell of an ask of anyone. I knew he was doomed from then. I was like, clearly his story is gonna culminate in him giving his breath to give someone else life. And he does. For a minute I thought it was going to be Blushweaver, although I wasn't sure if you could really fix a slit throat like that. But no, he gave his life to give the God King a tongue so the God King could use his power to save everything. And Lightsong! He was so good. He was so pure. I loved the building revelation as well of who he was in his former life, so we can kind of get a sense of like the difference between their mortal life and who they return as, and the kind of like things that stay. And I think I found that more interesting than the magic system this time around, although I guess this is part of the magic system. The kind of idea of like, what do you keep from your former life? It's almost an Amnesia plotline, but a little bit more unique and interesting. Like when Lightsong was learning that he was inherently good at some things like detective work and juggling, but inherently not good at other things like swordplay. It was good. It was good. Anyway, I think I've pretty much rambled myself dry on my thoughts on this book. It was a good time. I'm glad I read it. But it did not hook me as much as, for instance, Mistborn did. And I am excited because next up I am going to read the Wax and Wayne series, which I hear is underrated and really good. After I'm done reading through Wax and Wayne, I might give the Cosmere a little bit of a break, because I think I am starting to get a little bit burned out on the kind of repeating themes that keep propping up in every Sanderson book. I think it's inevitable with any author. If you go and read their entire bibliography, I think you're probably going to get burned out on the same themes and ideas which keep popping up, right? If I had to quantify it, I would say godhood and religion and the ascendance to godhood, formulaic magic systems, these are all things which are good and interesting, but if you read several books which continue to do this same idea over and over again, the kind of building blocks stick out to you in a way that they wouldn't otherwise. So while I was going to eventually build my way up to reading the first 5 Stormlight books, probably after either Wax and Wayne or the final standalone novels like The Secret Projects, I might actually just have a break and read some other stuff instead for a while. But yeah, I'm very excited to get started on the Bands of Mourning. I know the Wax and Wayne books are a little bit shorter as well, so I might get through them a little bit quicker. Although I'm getting through books quite quickly at the moment, which is fun to see, because a few years ago I was already having trouble finishing any book. But I will meet you back here for thoughts on that, although we'll probably finish Ashes of Man, the 5th book in the Sun Eater series first, so I'll meet you back here for that. Or some Doctor Who stuff, who knows. I will catch you then.